In the winter of 2018, a team of scientists published a paper in the journal Nature that quietly changed everything most people thought they knew about the origins of the British. The paper was about a skeleton that had been lying in a cave in Somerset for 9,000 years, buried under layers of limestone and time, and the accumulated weight of the millennia that had passed since the person it belonged to had last drawn breath. The skeleton had been found in 1903. It had been in a museum for more than a century. Scientists had studied it, analyzed it, debated it, and then, in 2018, they extracted DNA from it, from a tiny sample of the petrous bone behind the ear, which preserves genetic material better than almost any other part of the human body, and what they found when they read that DNA was not what anyone expected. The skeleton, belonged to a man who had lived in what is now Britain approximately 9,000 years ago, in the period archaeologists call the Mesolithic. The Middle Stone Age had dark to black skin. He had blue or blue-green eyes. He had dark, possibly curly hair. He was lactose intolerant. He metabolized starches differently from the way most modern Europeans do. And his DNA, when compared with the genetic profiles of every modern human population on Earth, did not closely match any of them. Not British people, not continental Europeans, not any population currently living anywhere in the world. He was, genetically speaking, a stranger. A person whose kind had lived in Britain for thousands of years before the ancestors of any modern Briton arrived, and who had then, in a process that is only now beginning to be understood in its full scale and its full strangeness, simply stopped being here. Replaced. Absorbed. Or possibly, in some more profound and harder to describe sense, erased. The man's name, given to him by the researchers and the media that picked up the story, was Cheddar Man. The cave where he was found is Gough's Cave, in the Cheddar Gorge in Somerset. He is the oldest, nearly complete human skeleton ever found in Britain. And the story that begins with him, the story of who really lived in Britain before the people we think of as ancient Britons, before the Romans, before the Saxons, before any of the peoples whose names appear in the historical record, is one of the most extraordinary and the most unsettling stories in the entire history of these islands. It is a story about genetics, but it is also a story about replacement, about the way that populations can be almost entirely swept away and substituted by different peoples in timescales that, in geological terms, are barely a blink, but that, in human terms, represent centuries of slow transformation and upheaval. It is a story about the people who built the earliest monuments on the British landscape, who quarried the stones, who arranged the great circles, who buried their dead in the long barrows that still stand on the chalk downlands of southern England, and about what happened to them when new people arrived from the east and the south with different genes, different technologies, different ways of living in the world. And it is, ultimately, a story about what it means to ask the question, who were the first Britons? Because the answer is not simple, it is not comfortable, and it is not finished. Before we go further into this story, and it goes very far and very deep and into places that the conventional histories of Britain rarely venture, please click like and subscribe if you find yourself drawn to the questions that the official record tends to leave unasked. Leave a comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from tonight. These stories deserve to be heard, and your support is what makes it possible to keep telling them. The ancient DNA revolution is only about 15 years old in terms of its ability to produce results of the quality and specificity that have changed our understanding of prehistory. For most of the 20th century, studying the genetics of ancient populations was essentially impossible. DNA degrades. It breaks apart over time, contaminated by the environment, altered by heat and moisture and the acids in the soil. The kind of DNA that can be meaningfully sequenced, read, letter by letter, in the long chemical alphabet of the genome, was thought to survive for only a few thousand years at most in most conditions, and even that was difficult to work with. Two things changed this. The first was the development of next-generation sequencing technology, which made it possible to read enormous quantities of highly fragmented DNA quickly and cheaply, and to assemble meaningful genetic information from thousands of tiny, damaged pieces that earlier technology could not have handled. The second was the understanding that certain bones, particularly the petrous portion of the temporal bone, a dense, rock-like structure behind the ear, preserved DNA significantly better than other parts of the skeleton, sometimes retaining readable genetic material for tens of thousands of years. The combination of these two developments opened a window that had been closed for all of human history. Suddenly, scientists could read the genomes of people who had lived not just hundreds, but thousands and even tens of thousands of years ago. They could compare those ancient genomes with each other and with the genomes of living people and map, with extraordinary precision, the movements and minglings and replacements of populations across time and space. They could ask not just where ancient people had come from, based on the artifacts they left behind or the shapes of their bones, but who they actually were, genetically, where their ancestors had lived, what physical traits they were likely to have had, how closely they were related to the people living in the same place today. What they found, when they applied these tools to the ancient inhabitants of the British Isles, was not a simple story of continuous occupation, of peoples living in the same place for generation after generation, changing gradually as the centuries passed. What they found was a story of almost complete replacement, of a population being effectively supplanted not once but twice in the prehistoric period, each time by people who came from far away and who carried with them a biology, a genome that was almost entirely unlike the biology of the people who had been there before them. The first of these ancient populations, the people whose DNA does not match any modern group, are what geneticists call Western hunter-gatherers. The term is their technical classification, but it only partially describes what they were and how they lived. These were the people of Mesolithic Britain, the Britain of 9,000 to 6,000 years ago, the Britain that existed after the last ice age had retreated and before the first farmers arrived. They were hunter-gatherers in the technical sense. They did not farm, did not keep livestock, did not live in permanent settlements in the way that later populations would. They moved through the landscape, following the herds and the seasons, fishing the rivers and the coasts, gathering plants and nuts and berries, burning sections of woodland to encourage the growth of the plants and the browsing animals they depended on. But hunter-gatherer carries, for modern ears, an implication of primitivism that is both inaccurate and misleading. These people were not primitive. They were culturally sophisticated, technologically inventive within the constraints of their material world, and genetically complex in ways that researchers are still working to fully understand. They had been living in Britain for thousands of years by the time the Mesolithic period began. Their ancestors had first moved into Britain at the end of the last ice age, tracking the herds northward as the glaciers retreated and the land warmed and the plants spread north across what had been frozen tundra. They knew the landscape with an intimacy that no subsequent population of Britain has ever matched, because they depended on that knowledge for their survival in a way that farming peoples, who create their own food rather than finding it, never have to. Their DNA, as revealed by the ancient genomics revolution, places them in a lineage that is distinct from any modern European population. They are most closely related, though still significantly different, to a group of ancient people who lived in Western and Northern Europe during and after the Ice Age, people who had survived the glacial maximum in refugia in what is now Spain, France, and the Balkans, and who had spread northward as the ice retreated. This lineage, the Western hunter-gatherer lineage, was, at the beginning of the Holocene, the primary human population across most of Western and Northern Europe. They lived in Spain, in France, in Germany, in Scandinavia, in the British Isles. They were, for a brief window of geological time, the humans of the West, but they are almost entirely gone. Modern Europeans carry, on average, perhaps 5 to 10% of Western hunter-gatherer ancestry in their genomes, diluted almost to invisibility by the two great waves of migration that followed them. And in Britain specifically, even that small percentage has been further reduced and complicated by the particular history of these islands. A history of replacement and arrival and further replacement that left the Western hunter-gatherers as genetic ghosts present in traces, present in fragmentary signals in the data, but not present in any meaningful, continuous, recognizable way in any living population today. Cheddar Man is the most famous of these ghosts. He is famous partly because of the drama of his discovery and rediscovery, a Victorian-era skeleton yielding, more than a century after its excavation, genetic secrets that no Victorian scientist could have imagined. But he is also famous because he puts a face to the abstraction. When the Natural History Museum in London commissioned a facial reconstruction based on his DNA and the structure of his skull, producing the now iconic image of a dark-skinned, blue-eyed man with full lips and curly dark hair, the response from the public was a mixture of fascination and genuine shock. Because the face that the reconstruction produced did not look like what most people, in Britain or elsewhere, imagined when they imagined ancient Britons. The iconography of ancient Britain, the imagery that has accumulated over centuries of artistic and scholarly imagination, tends toward the pale and the fierce, the blue woad-painted warriors of Roman accounts, the fair-haired Celts of Victorian imagination, the noble savages, and the druidic figures that populate the folklore of British origins. None of that imagery has any genetic basis in the actual ancient inhabitants of these islands. It is, in the light of the DNA evidence, a story that Britain's population has told about itself, an origin mythology that has almost no relationship to what the people who first inhabited these islands actually looked like. Cheddar Man's dark skin is not the anomaly. In the Mesolithic period, dark pigmentation was the norm among Western hunter-gatherer populations across Europe. The genetic variants associated with lighter skin pigmentation in modern Europeans appear to have been significantly rarer among pre-Neolithic European populations, and the selection pressure that drove those variants to high frequency, the reduced ultraviolet radiation at high latitudes, and, possibly, the lower vitamin D content of an agricultural diet compared to a hunter-gatherer diet that included substantial quantities of oily fish had not yet had its full effect. The light skin of modern northern Europeans is, in genetic terms, a relatively recent development. It is not the ancient condition but the derived one. The blue eyes are a different matter. Blue or light-colored eyes appear to have been present among Western hunter-gatherer populations at surprisingly high frequency, despite the dark skin, a combination that is extremely rare in modern populations, because in modern populations, the variants that produce light eyes and the variants that produce light skin tend to travel together, both having been selected for and spread through the same recent evolutionary process. In the ancient hunter-gatherers, these traits were decoupled. The light eye variant had arisen and spread, possibly as a sexually selected trait, while the skin pigmentation remained dark. Cheddar Man's blue eyes, in other words, are not an exception among the people of his time. They appear to have been common. What is exceptional is the survival of his remains, and the quality of the DNA extracted from them, and the fact that he is now the face of a population that has otherwise largely vanished from the historical imagination. Who else has been found? Who else has been studied? And what have their genomes told us about the ancient inhabitants of Britain? The answer is, more than you might expect, though still far fewer than researchers would like. Ancient DNA is difficult to recover, and the British climate, damp, acidic soils, temperature fluctuations, is not kind to organic materials over millennia. Many of the sites that archaeologists would most like to sample have not yielded sufficient DNA for meaningful analysis. But enough has been recovered to sketch a picture, fragmentary, still being filled in, but coherent enough to show us the outlines of a population that is genuinely unlike any modern group. Gough's cave itself has yielded more than Cheddar Man. The cave was used over an extended period in the late Upper Paleolithic, the period immediately after the last glacial maximum, around 14 to 15,000 years ago, as well as in the Mesolithic. The earlier occupants of the cave have left remains that are among the most disturbing in British archaeology, evidence of ritual cannibalism, of skulls modified into cups, of human bones, processed in ways that suggest complex mortuary practices very different from anything in the later archaeological record. The DNA of these earliest cave users places them in an even older lineage than Cheddar Man's the Magdalenian culture of southwestern Europe, one of the great sophisticated traditions of Upper Paleolithic art and technology. These people are related to those who painted the caves of Lascaux and Altamira. They were in Britain, briefly, before the final cold snap of the Younger Dryas forced them south again. They left their cups made of skulls and their worked bone tools and their genomic signatures in the cave sediments, and then they were gone, and the land they had briefly occupied lay empty and cold for another 1,000 years before anyone came back. The people who came back, the Mesolithic inhabitants, of whom Cheddar Man is the most complete representative, are genetically related to the Magdalenians, but distinct from them. They are part of the lineage that had survived the last glacial maximum in southwestern European refugia and had then spread north again as the climate improved, reaching Britain as Britain itself was still newly emerged from the ice and still connected by the low-lying landmass that geographers now call Doggerland to the rest of the European continent. Doggerland is a name for a world that existed and then did not. In the period immediately after the last ice age, roughly 12,000 to 8,000 years ago, a substantial landmass occupied what is now the southern North Sea and the English Channel. This was not a small shelf, but a significant territory. Plains, river systems, wetlands, coastlines, populated by the same Western hunter-gatherer peoples who lived across the rest of northwestern Europe, linked to both what is now Britain and what is now continental Europe. The people who walked from what is now France to what is now England did not walk across ice or water. They walked across grassland and marshes, following river valleys and coastlines, carrying with them the genes and the cultures and the languages, unknowable to us now, of the Mesolithic West. Then the sea rose. It rose gradually, then quickly, over the period from roughly 8,000 to 6,000 years ago, as the great ice sheets of the northern hemisphere continued to melt, and their meltwater poured into the world's oceans. The rivers that drained into the low plains of Doggerland became estuaries. The estuaries became bays. The bays became the open sea. And the people who had lived on that land, who had built their campsites there, who had caught their fish there, who had buried their dead there under the ground that is now the floor of the North Sea, had to move, north and west, into what is now Britain, east and south, onto the higher ground of what is now continental Europe. Or in some cases, perhaps, not at all. The drowning of Doggerland did something to the Western hunter-gatherers of Britain that is not fully appreciated in most accounts of British prehistory. It isolated them. Before the North Sea closed, Britain's Mesolithic population had been part of a continuous genetic network across northwestern Europe, capable of exchanging people and genes and ideas with a large and varied population on the continent. After the closure, Britain was an island. The Western hunter-gatherers, who remained in Britain, were cut off from the broader continental gene pool. They had, in a sense, been sealed in a relatively small population, isolated on an island for perhaps 1,000 years or more, before the next major event in British genetic history arrived from the south and east and changed everything. That event was farming, the Neolithic Revolution, the arrival of the first agriculturalists in Britain. And while it sounds, in the dry language of archaeology, like a technological transition from hunting and gathering to farming and herding, what the ancient DNA evidence shows us is that it was not primarily a technological transition at all. It was a population replacement, a genomic substitution so complete and so sudden in terms of the timescales of population genetics that it constitutes one of the most dramatic demographic events in the entire prehistoric record of Europe. The farmers who brought the Neolithic to Britain, who arrived, beginning around 6,000 years ago, with their domesticated cattle and sheep and pigs, their emmer wheat and einkorn, their polished stone tools and their pottery, and their elaborate burial practices, were not Western hunter-gatherers who had learned to farm. They were genetically distinct people from a completely different ancestral background. Their DNA traces back to Anatolia, to what is now Turkey and the Eastern Mediterranean, where farming had been independently developed thousands of years earlier, and from where it had been spreading westward across Europe for millennia. These Anatolian Neolithic farmers were not closely related to the Western hunter-gatherers they were moving among and displacing. They had different skin pigmentation lighter, as has been shown by genomic analysis, different metabolisms, different disease histories, different physical stature. They were, in genomic terms, almost as different from the Mesolithic inhabitants of Europe as any two non-African human populations can be. And they did not assimilate with the Western hunter-gatherers peacefully or slowly, or in a way that left the genetic signatures of the original inhabitants at anything like their original frequency. The speed and the completeness of the genetic replacement in Britain is striking even by the standards of the European Neolithic transition. Across continental Europe, the arrival of Anatolian farmers produced a pattern of partial replacement. The farmers arrived, they spread, they intermingled to varying degrees with the hunter-gatherer populations they encountered, and the result was a mixed genetic signal. Modern continental Europeans typically show a mixture of Anatolian, Neolithic ancestry and Western hunter-gatherer ancestry that reflects this imperfect but real blending of peoples. In some regions, hunter-gatherer ancestry actually rebounds in the record centuries after the initial farmer arrival, suggesting that the two populations coexisted for a long time and continued to interact genetically. In Britain, this did not happen in the same way. The ancient DNA samples from Neolithic Britain, the people who built the long barrows and the causewayed enclosures and the earliest phases of the great monuments show an extremely high proportion of Anatolian Neolithic ancestry and extremely low levels of Western hunter-gatherer ancestry. The indigenous population of Britain, the people whose lineage had been here since the ice retreated, contributed almost nothing genetically to the people who built Stonehenge's earliest stages. The replacement was, by any measure, overwhelming. This is one of the great mysteries of British prehistory. Why was the replacement so complete? What happened to the Western hunter-gatherers? Were they killed? Were they enslaved? Did they die of diseases brought by the farmers, against which they had no immunity? Were they simply outcompeted, unable to sustain their population in the face of the higher birth rates and the greater caloric surplus that farming can provide? Or did something else happen, something that the genetic data hints at but does not fully explain? The honest answer is that we do not know. The ancient DNA evidence can tell us the result, can measure the before and the after with extraordinary precision, but it cannot directly tell us the mechanism. It cannot show us the violence, if there was violence. It cannot show us the disease, if there was disease. It can only show us that in a period of perhaps a few centuries, a short time in the life of a population, a long time in the life of a person, the dominant genetic signature of the people living in Britain shifted from overwhelmingly Western hunter-gatherer to overwhelmingly Anatolian Neolithic, with very little trace of the earlier population surviving in the subsequent record. What we do know, from the archaeological record that accompanies the DNA evidence, is that the transition was not seamless or peaceful in its effects on the landscape. The Mesolithic period in Britain is characterized archaeologically by a relatively light human footprint campsites, middens, worked flints scattered through the forest, signs of people moving through a landscape they were adapting to rather than transforming. The Neolithic, by contrast, transformed the landscape profoundly and rapidly. The great deciduous forests of lowland Britain, which had expanded to cover most of the island as the climate warmed after the Ice Age, were cut down. Clearings were made, fields were laid out, animals were herded and penned, and the land was marked, in ways that still visible today, with the monuments that the Neolithic farmers built for their dead and, presumably, for their gods. The long barrows of southern England, the great earthen and stone structures that stand on the downlands of Wiltshire and Dorset and the Cotswolds, many of them still visible from the road, many of them still containing the skeletal remains of the people who were buried in them, are the most enduring physical legacy of the Neolithic farmers of Britain. These are the people whose DNA has been extracted and sequenced, the people whose genomes tell us about the overwhelming replacement of the earlier hunter-gatherer population. They were Anatolian Neolithic in their ancestry, with very little hunter-gatherer admixture. They were, by modern standards, short. The skeletal evidence suggests an average height of around 5 feet and 5 or 6 inches for men, somewhat less for women. They had a skull shape, rounded, brachycephalic, that is distinct from the longer-headed morphology that characterizes many later British populations. And they practiced a form of communal burial, placing the bones of many individuals in shared chambers over generations that reflects a vision of death and the afterlife, very different from anything in the later record. These are the people who, in the current state of the evidence, appear to have built the early phases of Stonehenge. Not the full monument, the Great Sarsen Circle and the trilithons that stand today were erected considerably later, but the earthwork enclosure, the original timber circle, The cremation cemetery that preceded the stone monument. The evidence for this comes from a combination of radiocarbon dates, which place the earliest phase of Stonehenge's construction around 5,000 years ago, and ancient DNA studies of the human remains found at and near the site, which show the Anatolian Neolithic genetic profile characteristic of the British Neolithic population. There is something profound about this. The most famous monument in Britain, the one that appears on postcards and in tourist brochures, the one that millions of people visit every year, the one that is, for many people in Britain and around the world, a symbol of the deep and ancient roots of British civilization, was built by people who are not ancestral to modern Britons in any meaningful genetic sense. The builders of Stonehenge are genetic strangers to the people who now visit it. They came from somewhere very far away, culturally and biologically. They transformed the landscape with extraordinary effort and extraordinary skill, and then they too were replaced, almost as thoroughly as they had replaced the people who came before them. The second great genetic upheaval in British prehistory began around 4,500 years ago, and it was, if anything, even more dramatic in its effects than the Neolithic transition had been. This was the arrival in Britain of people associated with what archaeologists call the Bell Beaker culture, named for their distinctive style of pottery, a flared, bell-shaped drinking vessel found in graves across a vast swath of Western and Central Europe from around this period. The Bell Beakers are one of the most debated and most fascinating phenomena in European prehistory, and their genetic story, as revealed by the ancient DNA evidence, is extraordinary. The people who brought Bell Beaker material culture to Britain, who buried their dead with those distinctive pots, with copper daggers and gold ornaments and stone archers' wrist guards, in individual graves, rather than the communal chambers of the Neolithic, carried in their genomes a substantial proportion of ancestry from the Pontic-Caspian steppe. This is the great grassland that extends across what is now Ukraine and Russia and Kazakhstan, north of the Black Sea and east of the Caucasus Mountains. The people of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, known to geneticists as Yamnaya or steppe ancestry, had themselves undergone a genetic history of extraordinary complexity, being a mixture of Eastern European hunter-gatherer ancestry, Caucasian hunter-gatherer ancestry, and early Iranian farmer ancestry. They were, in genomic terms, a novel kind of person, a person assembled from ingredients that had never previously been combined in that particular way, in a landscape at the interface of Europe and Asia. The steppe people had been expanding westward into Europe from around 5,000 years ago, carried by a combination of factors that researchers debate with considerable vigor, possibly the domestication of the horse, which transformed the strategic possibilities of the steppe in ways analogous to the later introduction of the stirrup, possibly the invention of wheeled vehicles, which made it possible to move goods and people across the steppe at scales previously impossible, possibly the development of a pastoral economy capable of supporting high population densities in an environment that would not support agriculture, possibly the advantage of new diseases, to which the steppe populations had developed some immunity through long exposure, and which they may have transmitted with devastating effect to the sedentary farming populations of Europe. Whatever the mechanism, the demographic consequences across continental Europe were severe and rapid. The ancient DNA data shows a near-total replacement of Anatolian Neolithic ancestry by steppe-related ancestry across large parts of Europe in the late 3rd millennium before the Common Era, a replacement that, in some regions, occurred in the space of a few centuries. The Yamnaya and their derivatives, the corded ware people of Central and Northern Europe, the battle-axe cultures of Scandinavia, the Bell Beaker people of Western Europe, spread across the continent with a genetic impact that rivals or exceeds the earlier spread of the Anatolian Neolithic farmers. In Britain, the Bell Beaker transition produced results that ancient DNA researchers, when they first fully processed the data, described as among the most striking findings they had encountered in the entire study of ancient European genetics. The Neolithic people of Britain, the Anatolian ancestry farmers, the people of the Long Barrows, the people of early Stonehenge, contributed, according to the best current estimates, somewhere between 0 and 10% of their ancestry to the subsequent Bronze Age population of Britain. In some regions of Britain, the replacement appears to have been even more complete than that. The Anatolian Neolithic ancestry, which had itself replaced the Western hunter-gatherer ancestry so thoroughly just a few centuries before, was now itself replaced. Within the span of a few centuries, perhaps 300 to 500 years, the dominant genetic profile of the people living in Britain shifted, with extraordinary completeness, for the second time in 2,000 years. What the people of Bronze Age Britain looked like, on the basis of their genomes, was quite different from what the Neolithic people before them had looked like. The steppe ancestry they carried brought with them the genetic variants associated with lighter skin pigmentation, which were at high frequency in steppe populations. It also brought, with very high probability, the genetic variants associated with lactase persistence, the ability to digest lactose, the sugar in milk, into adulthood, which is extremely rare in non-European populations globally, but reaches very high frequencies in modern Northern Europeans, and which appears to have been strongly selected for in populations that depended heavily on dairy products. The steppe ancestry also brought different disease resistances, different height distributions. Steppe people appear to have been taller, on average, than the Neolithic farmers they were replacing, and almost certainly different languages. The language question is one of the most contested and most significant aspects of the genetic story. Modern European languages, with the exceptions of Basque, Finnish, Estonian, and Hungarian, belong to the Indo-European family, a vast and diverse linguistic grouping that includes not only the European languages but also Persian, Hindi, Bengali, and dozens of other languages across Asia. The question of where Indo-European languages originated and how they spread across such a vast geographic area has been debated by linguists and archaeologists for more than 2 centuries. The ancient DNA evidence has not conclusively settled this debate, but it has pointed very strongly toward the Pontic-Caspian steppe as the source of the linguistic expansion, because the steppe populations, whose genetics track so precisely with the Bell Beaker and corded ware expansions, are the populations most plausibly associated with the ancestral Indo-European language community. If this is correct, and the evidence for it is now strong enough that most specialists in the field take it very seriously, then the Bell Beaker migration to Britain was not just a genetic replacement. It was also, in all probability, a linguistic one. The languages spoken by the Neolithic farmers of Britain, whatever those languages were, and we have no direct evidence of them, only the silence where they should be in the record, were replaced by an ancestral form of the Indo-European languages that would ultimately develop, through the Bronze Age and Iron Age, and the subsequent millennia of historical change, into the Celtic languages, and eventually into English, Welsh, Gaelic, and the other languages that have been spoken in Britain in the historical period. The Neolithic farmers arrived, replaced the hunter-gatherers, and spoke languages that vanished without a trace. The Bell Beaker migrants arrived, replaced the farmers, and spoke languages that became the ancestors of everything that followed. In both cases, the replacement was so complete that almost nothing of the superseded culture survived into the subsequent period, not the genes, not the language, not, as far as we can tell, the religious or cultural practices in any recognizable form. This is the central mystery that the ancient DNA evidence has revealed. Not just that Britain's oldest inhabitants were genetically distinct from modern populations, but that they were replaced not once, but twice, each time, almost completely. Each time, by people who came from far away and who were genetically almost unrelated to the people they displaced. The island of Britain, far from being a place of deep and continuous inhabitation by a single people, who evolved and changed gradually over time, was effectively repopulated multiple times. The people living in Britain today are, in a very real genetic sense, not the descendants of Britain's oldest inhabitants. They are the descendants of people who arrived and swept the previous inhabitants aside. But who were those oldest inhabitants? Who were the Western hunter-gatherers? Not just in genetic terms, but as people, as cultures, as societies, as communities of human beings living and dying and making meaning in a landscape that we can still walk through today. The archaeological record of Mesolithic Britain is rich enough to give us some answers, though it is always constrained by the fundamental problem of Mesolithic archaeology. These people left almost nothing that survives. No monuments, no pottery, no permanent architecture in any material that endures. Their world was built of wood and hide and bone and plant material, all of which rot away in the centuries and millennia after abandonment. What survives are the things made of stone, the flint tools, the microliths, the scrapers and blades and points, and occasionally, in conditions that are unusual enough to be celebrated, the organic materials that the acidic British soils generally destroy. Starcar, in Yorkshire, is one of those unusual conditions. It is a site on the edge of a Mesolithic lake, a lake that no longer exists, having silted up and been drained over the millennia, where the waterlogged conditions preserved organic material that would normally have been lost entirely. The excavations at Starcar, which began in the 1940s and have continued with various interruptions ever since, have recovered material that gives us a window into the Mesolithic world that is almost uniquely clear. There are worked antler headdresses, stag skulls with the antlers modified, perforated for attachment, apparently worn by people, possibly in ritual contexts, possibly for hunting camouflage, possibly for both. There are the earliest known construction at any site in Britain, a wooden platform, a boardwalk built out over the edge of the lake to provide access to the water. There are traces of a substantial settlement, larger and more permanent than the typical Mesolithic campsite, suggesting that this location was a place of repeated return, of seasonal gathering, of something that begins to look, in its scale and its permanence, like a home. The people of Starcar were Western hunter-gatherers. Their DNA, if it could be recovered, and the conditions at the site, while exceptional for organic preservation, have not yielded usable ancient DNA so far, would presumably place them in the same genetic lineage as Cheddar Man, separated from him by a few centuries, and the width of England. They lived approximately 11,000 years ago, at the very beginning of the Mesolithic, when the lake was fresh, and the forest had not yet grown in, and the reindeer still moved through the landscape in herds that rivaled the bison herds of the later North American plains. What would they have been like? The honest answer is that we know frustratingly little, because everything that might have told us directly, their language, their music, their stories, their social structures, their spiritual beliefs has vanished without any recoverable trace. We can infer certain things. Hunter-gatherer societies, studied ethnographically around the world in the historical period, tend to be relatively egalitarian, with leadership based on personal authority and consensus, rather than inherited power, with sophisticated knowledge of the natural world, with rich ceremonial and spiritual lives that archaeologists tend to underestimate because the evidence for those lives rarely survives in the material record. The antler headdresses from Starcar suggest ritual practice of some kind, suggest people who dressed as animals, or dressed in honor of animals, who engaged in some form of practice that required the creation and wearing of a complex symbolic object. This is not the behavior of people who were simply surviving from day to day. This is the behavior of people embedded in a culture. The Red Lady of Paviland is one of the most famous and most misunderstood of Britain's ancient human remains. Found in a cave on the Gower Peninsula in South Wales in 1823 by the geologist William Buckland, the skeleton was interpreted by Buckland as belonging to a woman, a Romano-British woman, he thought, perhaps a prostitute associated with a nearby Roman military camp, who had been buried with the bones of extinct animals that Buckland assumed had been washed into the cave and mixed with the burial by ancient floods. He was wrong about almost everything. The skeleton belongs to a man, not a woman. It dates to approximately 33,000 years ago, during the Upper Paleolithic, not the Roman period. And the animal bones were not washed in by floods, but were placed deliberately in the grave, alongside ochre-red mineral pigment that gave the burial both its name and its extraordinary visual character. Because the bones of the Red Lady of Paviland are stained vivid red from the ochre that was scattered over them when the person was buried. The Red Lady, properly understood, is a person who lived during the last Ice Age, in a period when much of Britain was too cold and too inhospitable for permanent human occupation, but when southern Wales apparently offered conditions that at least some human groups could survive in, at least seasonally. The burial, the ochre, the placement of animal remains, The effort and the intentionality of it tells us that even 33,000 years ago, in the depths of an ice age, in what must have been conditions of extreme environmental stress, the people who lived here had cultural practices that included elaborate treatment of the dead. They had beliefs, presumably, about what death meant and what came after it. They had relationships with the people they buried, relationships that included grief and ritual, and the need to mark a death as something significant, something that required ceremony. The DNA of the Red Lady of Paviland has not been successfully recovered. The conditions in the cave and the age of the remains make this extremely difficult. But based on comparative analysis of other Upper Paleolithic Europeans of similar date, this person almost certainly belonged to an even earlier population lineage than the Western hunter-gatherers of the Mesolithic, a lineage that was largely swept away by the glacial maximum, the coldest period of the last ice age, between around 25 and 20,000 years ago, when Britain was essentially uninhabitable, and anyone who had been living there would have been forced south or would have perished. The Mesolithic Western hunter-gatherers, who returned to Britain after the ice retreated, were the descendants of the people who had survived in the southern European refugia, but they were not simply the same people. Thousands of years of separate evolution in different environments had made them genetically distinct from the earlier Upper Paleolithic occupants of Britain. Britain, in other words, has been repeatedly emptied and refilled. The Red Lady's people, whoever they were likely driven out or killed by the glacial maximum. The people who returned after the ice were different people. Those people were then replaced by the Anatolian Neolithic farmers. Those farmers were then replaced by the Bell Beaker migrants with their steppe ancestry. And then history, in the conventional sense, begins. The Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the Roman conquest, the Anglo-Saxon migrations, the Norse incursions, the Norman conquest, and all the subsequent movements and minglings that have produced the genetic mosaic of modern Britain. What does that mosaic look like? What do modern Britons actually carry in their genomes, and how does it relate to this extraordinary history of replacement and arrival? The answer, based on the most comprehensive genetic studies of the modern British population, including the large-scale People of the British Isles project, and subsequent analyses using ancient DNA to calibrate modern genetic variation, is that modern Britons are primarily descended from the Bell Beaker migrants with their steppe ancestry, with smaller but significant contributions from the Anatolian Neolithic farmers who preceded them, and very small traces, sometimes measurable, sometimes not, and varying considerably by region of Western hunter-gatherer ancestry. The proportions vary across Britain, with different regions reflecting different histories of subsequent migration and mixing, but the overwhelming signal everywhere is the steppe ancestry brought by the Bell Beaker people. And yet, even this is not quite the full picture, because the Bell Beaker migrants themselves were not a simple, uniform genetic group. They were already a mixture of different ancestries. Steppe ancestry, combined with a background of Neolithic European ancestry from the populations they had been moving through in continental Europe before reaching Britain. The Bell Beaker expansion was not a single migration but a series of waves and movements over several centuries, and the people who arrived in Britain were not genetically identical to the people who had generated the Bell Beaker culture on the Rhine or in Iberia. They had mixed and moved and changed, and what arrived in Britain was already a complex genetic composite. This complexity does not end with the prehistoric period. The historical period brought its own migrations, its own genetic inputs, its own replacements on a smaller scale. The Roman period added modest genetic contributions from southern Europe and the Middle East. The Roman military and its associated populations included people from across the empire, and some of those people settled, had children, and left descendants whose genetic contributions are still faintly detectable in certain regions of Britain. The Anglo-Saxon migrations of the 5th and 6th centuries CE brought substantial Germanic ancestry from what is now Germany and Denmark and the Netherlands that is still clearly visible in the genetic profiles of England, particularly in the east and the south, where the Anglo-Saxon settlement was heaviest. The Norse settlements of the 9th and 10th centuries left genetic traces in northern and eastern England, in Scotland, and particularly in the island communities of Orkney and Shetland, where Norse ancestry remains at notably high frequencies. And then, There are the more recent migrations of the modern period, the Jewish communities who came to Britain in various waves over the past 1,000 years, the Huguenots who fled religious persecution in France in the 17th century and settled predominantly in London and other English cities, the Irish who came in enormous numbers during and after the Great Famine of the 1840s, the Caribbean and South Asian communities who came in the post-war period, and the continued flow of migrants from across Europe and the world that has shaped the genetic diversity of modern Britain in ways that are still being documented and studied. All of this is the context in which the ancient DNA findings need to be understood. Modern Britons are not a genetically uniform group, and they are not the direct linear descendants of any single ancient population. They are a mosaic of all the populations that have moved through and settled in these islands over 15,000 years of post-Ice Age human history, with the steppe ancestry Bell Beaker migrants providing the dominant but not the exclusive genetic foundation. What the ancient DNA evidence makes clear, and what the conventional histories of Britain tend not to make sufficiently clear, is that the deepest layers of this history, the layers that predate the Bronze Age, predate the Neolithic, predate farming entirely, contributed almost nothing to the genetic makeup of modern Britons. The Western hunter-gatherers, the people whose DNA does not match any modern population, the people of Cheddar Man and Starkar, and the great Mesolithic tradition that persisted in Britain for 5,000 years after the Ice Age, these people are the great genetic gap in the British story. They were here. They were the people of this land for thousands of years. And then they were not. And nothing of what they were survives in recognizable form in any living population today. The question of what happened to them, how and why the replacement was so complete, is one that researchers are still actively investigating, and the emerging picture is complicated and, in some of its aspects, genuinely troubling. One line of evidence suggests that disease played a major role. When two populations that have been separated for extended periods come into contact, the exchange of infectious diseases can be catastrophic for the population that has had less exposure to the pathogens the other group carries. This is dramatically illustrated in the historical record by the demographic collapse of indigenous American populations following European contact populations that had been separated from Eurasian disease pools for 15,000 years, and that had therefore not developed immunological resistance to the diseases that Europeans carried. The parallels with the Mesolithic, Neolithic contact in Europe are not perfect. The populations involved had not been separated for nearly as long, and the diseases involved were likely different. But the potential for differential disease impact is real and significant. The Anatolian Neolithic farmers came from a background of contact with domesticated animals, cattle, sheep, pigs, goats, that Western hunter-gatherers did not have. Zoonotic diseases, diseases that jump from animals to humans, would have been part of the disease ecology of farming communities in ways that they would not have been for hunter-gatherers who interacted with wild animals but did not keep them in close, permanent proximity. If the farmers carried diseases to which the hunter-gatherers had little or no immunity, the demographic consequences could have been severe, not necessarily in the form of a single catastrophic epidemic, but in the form of elevated mortality rates over decades and centuries that would have systematically reduced hunter-gatherer populations below the threshold of demographic viability. But disease alone is unlikely to explain the completeness of the genetic replacement. Disease kills people, but it does not necessarily prevent the survivors and their descendants from contributing genetically to the subsequent population. Even in the case of post-contact population collapse in the Americas, which was far more severe than anything documented in the European Neolithic transition, significant amounts of indigenous genetic ancestry survive in many modern American populations. In Neolithic Britain, the hunter-gatherer ancestry is so vanishingly rare in the subsequent population that something more than disease mortality is needed to account for it. Some researchers have proposed that direct violence raiding, warfare, the systematic killing of hunter-gatherer communities, was a significant factor. The Neolithic archaeological record across Europe includes sites of apparent massacre, places where large numbers of individuals were killed and left unburied, their bones showing the marks of violence. in contexts that suggest organized intergroup conflict rather than individual or small-scale aggression. The best known of these sites are on the continent Aspern, Schletz in Austria, Talheim in Germany, but similar evidence of violence has been found in British Neolithic contexts, and the overall picture suggests that the arrival of farming populations in Europe was not uniformly peaceful. A further factor, one that interacts with both disease and violence, is simple demographic arithmetic. Farming populations can sustain higher population densities than hunter-gatherer populations on the same area of land because farming extracts more calories from the land than foraging does. This means that a farming population, arriving in a hunter-gatherer territory, can grow in numbers faster than the indigenous population can. Over generations, the sheer numerical advantage of the incoming population can produce genetic dominance even in the absence of any direct conflict, simply because the farmers have more children who survive to reproduce, and the ratio of farmer to hunter-gatherer in the population shifts steadily over time. The combination of all these factors, disease, violence, demographic advantage, and possibly others that the evidence does not yet allow us to identify, produced, in Britain, a genetic transition of extraordinary completeness. And then, a couple of thousand years later, it happened again. The Anatolian Neolithic farmers of Britain, who had so thoroughly replaced the hunter-gatherers, were themselves replaced with similarly extreme thoroughness by the Bell Beaker migrants from the steppe. The mechanisms were probably similar in their broad outlines, though the specifics remain debated. What emerges from this story is a vision of British prehistory that is genuinely difficult to absorb. The conventional historical narrative tends to imagine the past as a series of layers, each building on what came before, the earlier peoples contributing to the later peoples who contributed to us. In this vision, the Romans built on Celtic Iron Age foundations. The Anglo-Saxons modified what the Romans had built, the Normans modified what the Anglo-Saxons had built, and so on. With the deeper layers, the Bronze Age, the Neolithic, the Mesolithic, forming a kind of bedrock of ancient Britishness that underlies everything subsequent. The ancient DNA evidence dismantles this layered vision and replaces it with something more like a series of full-scale substitutions. The Mesolithic is not the bedrock of Bronze Age genetics. It was almost entirely swept away. The Neolithic is not the bedrock of modern British genetics. It was almost entirely swept away. The bedrock, such as it is, comes from the Bell Beaker migrations, and even that bedrock is more recent and more foreign to the intuitions of most people thinking about British identity than most people are aware. There are regions of Britain where the story is somewhat different, where later migrants arrived in smaller numbers, or where the geographic remoteness of the region meant that the waves of replacement did not roll through with the same force that they had across the lowlands of southern and eastern England. The upland areas of Wales, Scotland, and Ireland have consistently shown somewhat different genetic profiles from lowland England, higher proportions of Neolithic ancestry, in some cases, or genetic signals that suggest populations with slightly different histories of replacement and mixture. But even in these regions, the Western hunter-gatherer ancestry, the DNA of the people who were in Britain first, after the ice is present only at extremely low levels. Whatever the regional variations in the subsequent history, the Mesolithic substrate is essentially absent everywhere. The people of Cheddar Man's lineage are not lurking in the Welsh hills or the Scottish highlands, genetically preserved by the relative isolation of those regions. They are gone, as thoroughly as anywhere else, replaced by the two great waves of migration that swept through Britain in the prehistoric period. This is not a comfortable finding for people who have invested emotionally in the idea of ancient British identity, the idea of a continuous line from the first inhabitants to the present. But it is what the evidence shows, and the evidence has been produced by teams of researchers across multiple institutions and multiple countries, working with increasingly large samples of ancient DNA and increasingly sophisticated analytical tools over the past 15 years. It is not a fringe finding. It is not a controversial claim in the scientific community. It is the current state of knowledge about the genetic history of Britain, and it is as well established as any finding in this relatively young field. What it is profoundly interesting, because the questions it raises about identity, about belonging, about what it means to think of a place as having original inhabitants who deserve to be remembered and understood are questions that reach far beyond the technical details of ancient genomics and into the heart of how human beings understand their relationship to the land and the past. The Orkney genome is one of the most interesting regional anomalies in the British ancient DNA dataset, and it deserves a level of attention that the broad strokes narrative of replacement tends to crowd out. The Orkney Islands, off the northern tip of Scotland, were the site of one of the most extraordinary concentrations of Neolithic monument building in all of Europe. The Ring of Brodgar, the Stones of Stenness, the Passage Tomb of Maeshowe, and the settlement at Skara Brae, a complete Neolithic village preserved under sand dunes on the shore of the Bay of Scale, with stone furniture still standing in its houses, uncovered by a storm in 1850, represent a flowering of Neolithic culture in a remote and wind-swept archipelago that is completely unexpected in its sophistication and its scale. The people who built these monuments and lived in these villages were Neolithic farmers, genetically consistent with the broader Anatolian Neolithic ancestry that characterizes British Neolithic populations generally. But the Orkney genome dataset shows something interesting. Within the Orkney ancient DNA samples, the proportion of Western hunter-gatherer ancestry is slightly but measurably higher than in most other British Neolithic populations. It is not dramatically higher. The Orkney Neolithic people were still overwhelmingly Anatolian Neolithic in their ancestry as elsewhere, but the hunter-gatherer signal is detectable, and it is relatively more prominent than in contemporaneous populations further south. What does this mean? One interpretation is that the extreme geographic remoteness of Orkney meant that the initial replacement of hunter-gatherers by farmers was somewhat less complete there than in more accessible regions, that some hunter-gatherer populations managed to survive in these islands for longer, or that the mixing of hunter-gatherers and farmers happened to a slightly greater degree, leaving a faint but real genetic trace in the Neolithic inhabitants of the archipelago. Another interpretation is that the Orkney population was founded partly by a different migration route from the west and north, rather than from the south and east. That included a slightly different mixture of ancestries from the beginning. Whichever interpretation is correct, the Orkney case illustrates an important point. The replacement process was not perfectly uniform across Britain. Geography mattered, remoteness mattered, local population histories mattered, and while the overall picture is one of overwhelming replacement, the details, when examined closely enough, show variation that reflects the complexity of the process as it played out across the diverse landscapes and island geographies of the British Isles. The Scottish Highlands show a similar pattern of nuance, though the ancient DNA dataset from this region is less complete than from the southern lowlands, partly because the acidic soils of much of Scotland are unfavourable to DNA preservation. What data exists suggests that the Bell Beaker replacement was slightly less complete in some highland regions, that pockets of higher Neolithic ancestry survived longer in geographically isolated areas, though the overall pattern of steppe ancestry dominance in the Bronze Age holds across Scotland as well as England. Ireland presents its own particular story. The ancient DNA data from Ireland is now extensive enough to trace the Neolithic transition and the subsequent Bell Beaker arrival in considerable detail, and what it shows is broadly consistent with the British picture, but with some intriguing differences in timing and in the subsequent preservation of Neolithic ancestry. Ireland's Neolithic population, the people who built the extraordinary passage tomb at Newgrange, and the megalithic complexes at Carrowmore and Carrowkeel, shows a striking feature, a detectable level of relatedness within the sample, suggesting that the founding farming population of Ireland was relatively small, and that subsequent population expansion occurred partly through the growth of this initial founder group, rather than through continued immigration. The passage tomb builders of Ireland were, in a sense, a tight-knit community descended from a relatively small number of initial colonizers, and their genetic isolation on an island meant that their particular genomic profile diverged somewhat from the Neolithic populations of Britain and continental Europe. The Bell Beaker transition in Ireland was dramatic, as it was in Britain, but Ireland also shows something that Britain generally does not: a degree of Neolithic ancestry survival into and beyond the Bronze Age that is higher than the British average. Modern Irish people carry slightly more Neolithic ancestry, on average, than modern English people, and this may reflect a somewhat more complex history of the two populations, the Bell Beaker migrants and the Neolithic farmers, interacting and mixing over time in the Irish context, rather than the near-total replacement seen in Britain. None of these regional nuances changes the fundamental story. The deepest layer, the Western hunter-gatherer foundation, the people of the Mesolithic, is absent from the genetic profiles of modern populations throughout Britain and Ireland at any meaningful level. The question of who these people were, and what their world was like, and why they vanished so completely, remains one of the most profound and underappreciated mysteries in the entire history of these islands. Part of what makes this mystery particularly challenging is the absence of anything that might tell us directly about these people's inner lives, their language, their stories, their understanding of the world. Language is the most direct window into a culture's way of making meaning, and the languages of Western hunter-gatherer Europe have vanished without a trace. Not even a trace of the kind that historical linguists can work, with no words borrowed into later languages, no place names that preserve phonological features of an earlier tongue, no inscriptions or records. Total silence. This is not, actually, as unusual as it might seem. Languages disappear very quickly when their speakers are replaced or absorbed by speakers of other languages. Within a generation or two, if children are growing up speaking the language of the dominant group, the ancestral language can move from widespread use to complete extinction. The languages of the Western hunter-gatherers would have had no prestige, no writing system, no institutional support, no reason to be preserved by the incoming farming populations who replaced their speakers. They died with the people who spoke them, or shortly after. What we can perhaps infer, tentatively and speculatively, about the languages of the Western hunter-gatherers is that they were structurally unlike the Indo-European languages that replaced them, because Indo-European languages, while diverse in many ways, share deep structural features that reflect their common ancestry, and the Western hunter-gatherer languages almost certainly did not share those features, coming from a completely independent linguistic tradition that had developed over thousands of years in the post-Ice Age West. Whether they were similar to each other, whether the hunter-gatherers of Britain and France and Spain and Germany spoke related languages, reflecting their shared genetic ancestry, is unknown. They might have been. A genetic relatedness does not automatically imply linguistic relatedness, but it makes it at least plausible that people who had been part of the same genetic community for thousands of years had maintained some linguistic connections as well. The spiritual lives of the Western hunter-gatherers are another total unknown, except insofar as the archaeological evidence allows us to infer that they had them. The antler headdresses of Star Car, the careful burial of the Red Lady of Paviland with ochre and grave goods, the extraordinary art, carved and engraved figurines, notched bones that may record lunar cycles, or hunting tallies that appears in the European Upper Paleolithic and Mesolithic record. All of this tells us that these were people who engaged in symbolic behavior, who made objects with meanings beyond their immediate practical function, who treated the dead with ceremony and intention. Beyond that, the specifics are irrecoverable. What the physical landscape of Mesolithic Britain looked like, and how these people related to it, is somewhat better known, because the environmental record is richer than the human record. Britain in the Mesolithic was heavily forested. The great deciduous forest of lime and hazel and oak and elm that had expanded northward after the Ice Age covered most of the lowlands, with the uplands in more open vegetation, and the coasts offering the combination of woodland and marine resources that the Mesolithic population appears to have particularly favoured. The hunter-gatherers of Britain were primarily forest and coastal people. They exploited the forest edge, the rivers, the coastline, the wetlands. They burned sections of forest to encourage the growth of food plants and browsing animals. An active management of the landscape that contradicts the image of hunter-gatherers as simply passively foraging through a pristine wilderness. They were landscape managers, in their way, though their management left a much lighter footprint than agriculture. The rivers and coasts were particularly important to them. The evidence for fishing in the Mesolithic British record is extensive. Fish bones, harpoon points, wicker fish traps, preserved in waterlogged sites, and middens rubbish heaps, composed primarily of shellfish remains, piled up over generations at favoured coastal and estuarine locations. These middens, which occur throughout coastal Britain and particularly in Scotland, represent not just dumps, but sites of long-term return places where people came back year after year, generation after generation, to exploit the reliable and highly productive resources of the intertidal zone. Some middens are so extensive accumulations of shells and bones covering areas of hundreds of square meters and meters deep that they represent centuries of use by significant numbers of people. The people who created them were not wandering randomly through the landscape. They had home territories, favoured locations, routes of seasonal movement that they followed with regularity and precision. The Mesolithic population of Britain was not large by modern standards. Estimates based on the carrying capacity of the environment and the density of sites in the archaeological record suggest a few tens of thousands of people at most, possibly considerably fewer. But spread across an island that was rich in resources relative to the demands of a hunter-gatherer economy, tens of thousands of people would have been fully capable of developing distinct regional traditions, distinct social identities, distinct ways of being human in their particular corner of the world. None of those traditions, identities, or ways of being human survived in any recognizable form in the historical and cultural record. The Neolithic farmers who arrived did not adopt the practices of the hunter-gatherers, did not learn their languages, did not integrate their spiritual traditions, or if they did, none of it left any trace. The transformation was not a conversation between peoples. It was a replacement of one people by another, and everything that made the first people themselves was lost. This is a loss that most people have never been told to mourn, because most people do not know that these people existed. Not in the sense of understanding that they were a distinct population with a distinct culture that was erased. The story of British prehistory, as taught in schools and told in popular histories, tends to begin with the Bronze Age at the earliest, and more often with the Iron Age Celts or the Roman conquest. The Mesolithic is a footnote, if it appears at all. The Western hunter-gatherers are an abstraction, not a people. The ancient DNA evidence is changing that. Cheddar Man's face, reconstructed from his genome, and his skull, looking out of the pages of science journals and the windows of museum displays, is a face that makes the Western hunter-gatherers visible in a way they have never been before. He is a person. He has a face. He has blue eyes that looked at a landscape that was both like and unlike the landscape of modern Somerset. He existed, and he was here, and then he was gone, and the people who are here now are not, in any meaningful genetic sense, his descendants. What do we do with that? What does it mean for questions of identity, of belonging, of connection to the land? These are not questions that ancient DNA can answer. They are questions that the data raises and then leaves to the rest of us to wrestle with. One response is to note that genetic ancestry is not the only form of cultural ancestry. Modern Britons may not carry Mesolithic genes in any significant quantity, but they walk through a landscape that those Mesolithic people shaped, forests that were managed by their burning, rivers that were fished by their harpoons, coasts where their middens still lie under the turf. They live in proximity to the monuments built by the Neolithic farmers, who replaced the Mesolithic people, Stonehenge and Avebury, and the long barrows and those monuments, regardless of whether their builders are ancestral in the genetic sense, are part of the cultural landscape that modern Britons inhabit and that shapes their relationship to the past. Cultural inheritance is not the same as genetic inheritance, and the two can diverge completely. Another response is simply to sit with the strangeness of it, to let the fact of these lost people, these people whose kind lived in Britain for 5,000 years and then were gone, register as genuinely strange, genuinely significant, genuinely worth the attention that the ancient DNA revolution has made possible for the first time. The Western hunter-gatherers of Britain are not a historical curiosity. They are a presence, or rather the outline of a presence, the shape of something that was there and is not. And the questions their genetic fingerprint raises: who were they? What happened to them? What is lost when a people and its culture and its language and its way of knowing the world disappears completely, are not antiquarian questions. They are questions about what it means to be human in a world where such disappearances have happened, and will happen, and are happening. The ancient DNA evidence has also begun to reveal something else about the Western hunter-gatherers that adds another layer of complexity to the picture. They were not a genetically uniform group. The label Western hunter-gatherers covers a significant range of genetic diversity, reflecting the complex history of post-Ice Age repopulation of Europe from different refugia and the subsequent geographic isolation of different hunter-gatherer communities across the continent. The hunter-gatherers of Scandinavia were genetically distinct from those of Iberia. The hunter-gatherers of the Eastern Baltic were distinct from those of Western Europe. And within Britain itself, the evidence, though limited by the small number of ancient samples, suggests that the Mesolithic population was not entirely homogeneous. Different parts of Britain may have been settled by slightly different hunter-gatherer groups with slightly different ancestral compositions, reflecting the diverse routes by which post-Ice Age populations reached and spread across the island. This internal diversity is obscured by the near-total replacement that followed, but it is there in the ancient data, and it suggests that the Mesolithic population of Britain was itself a complex, varied, regionally differentiated people, not a monolithic culture, but a patchwork of communities with shared genetic roots, but potentially quite different local traditions and adaptations. The relationship between the Western hunter-gatherers and the Neolithic farmers who replaced them is also more complex than a simple wave of conquest. In continental Europe, there is clear evidence that hunter-gatherers and farmers coexisted in some regions for extended periods, that the two populations lived in proximity, interacted, and in some cases interbred, even as the overall demographic trend moved toward farmer dominance. This coexistence is visible in the genetic record as a gradual increase in hunter-gatherer ancestry in some European Neolithic samples over time, a signal of ongoing admixture between the two populations across centuries of contact. In Britain, this signal is weak. The hunter-gatherer ancestry in British Neolithic samples is very low, and it does not show the rebound that some continental populations display. This suggests that the contact and coexistence phase in Britain was shorter, or the mixing was more restricted, or both, that whatever interaction occurred between the arriving farmers and the incumbent hunter-gatherers happened less or left less genetic legacy than in comparable situations on the continent. Why this might be the case in Britain specifically is not clear. It may relate to the island geography, to the fact that once Britain was fully island enclosed, there was no continuing flow of hunter-gatherer groups from the continent that might have sustained the hunter-gatherer population against the demographic pressure of the farmers. Or it may relate to the specific character of the farming expansion into Britain, to the possibility that the farmers who arrived were particularly numerous, or particularly aggressive, in their displacement of the indigenous population, or simply had a particular disease advantage that proved catastrophic for the indigenous people. The answers to these questions are not yet in the data and may never be fully recoverable. But the questions are important because they touch on the fundamental nature of the process that produced the Britain of 5,000 years ago, the Britain of the Neolithic, of the long barrows, of the early phases of Stonehenge, and that set the stage for the subsequent Bell Beaker replacement that would produce the genetic foundation of modern Britain. The ghost populations of ancient genetics are one of the field's most fascinating and least publicly known findings. A ghost population, in the technical language of population genetics, is a population whose existence is inferred from statistical signals in the genomes of other ancient or modern populations, but for which no direct ancient DNA evidence has yet been found. These are populations that existed, that contributed genetic material to subsequent populations, but that have not left any directly sequenced individual genomes in the archaeological record. The history of Britain's genetic past includes at least one significant ghost population, a group whose genetic contribution to later populations can be detected statistically, but whose archaeological identity is uncertain. This ghost ancestry appears in the Neolithic samples from certain regions as a component that is neither clearly Anatolian Neolithic nor Western hunter-gatherer, but seems to represent a third stream of ancestry, possibly from populations in the Western Mediterranean or along the Atlantic. Facade of Europe, that have not been directly sampled. The presence of this ghost in the British Neolithic data suggests that the genetic history of these islands, even in the Neolithic, was more complex than the simple Anatolian farmer replaces hunter-gatherer narrative implies. Ghost populations are a reminder of the gaps in the ancient DNA record of all the people who lived and died in these islands and in the regions that fed them genetically, whose remains have not survived, or have not been sampled, or have not yet been analyzed. The ancient DNA record of Britain is growing rapidly, as researchers extract and sequence genetic material from an increasing number of archaeological sites, but it remains a small and incomplete sample of the actual population that lived in these islands over the past 15,000 years. Every new sample has the potential to reveal something unexpected, a new component of ancestry, a new lineage, a connection to a distant population that was not previously known to have had any relationship with ancient Britain. This incompleteness is both a limitation and an invitation. It means that the story of Britain's genetic past is still being written, that the current understanding, as compelling and as well supported as it is not the final word, and that the next decade of research will almost certainly produce findings that complicate or enrich, or in some cases, fundamentally revise what is currently known. The ancient DNA field is extraordinary in the speed with which it has moved, and in the degree to which its findings have overturned previously confident assumptions, and there is no reason to think that pace has slowed. The most recent research has begun to look at finer scales of detail than the broad population-level replacement story allows, examining the patterns of migration and mixing within the populations that arrived in Britain, tracing the movements of specific family groups and lineages within the archaeological record, beginning to reconstruct the social structures of ancient communities from the genetic relationships between the individuals buried in them. This fine-scale work is producing findings that are, in their way, just as striking as the broad population story. Studies of Neolithic burial sites in Britain have found that some long barrows, communal tombs that accumulated the bones of many individuals over generations, show patterns of genetic relatedness consistent with these being the burial sites of specific family lineages. The same few ancestral lines appear again and again in the bones of a single tomb, suggesting that access to prestigious burial sites was restricted to particular family groups, and that there was, in Neolithic Britain, a social structure with hereditary elements, with families or clans that controlled resources, including the resource of a proper burial in the community's monument. This is significant because it complicates the egalitarian image that the term hunter-gatherer or even simple farmer conjures. The Neolithic communities of Britain were not flat, structureless societies of equals. They had hierarchies, hereditary privileges, families that mattered more than other families in the social calculus of who got to be remembered and who did not. The bones of the people, who were not important enough to be buried in the monuments, have generally not survived. They were not placed in the preserving conditions of a sealed stone chamber. They were left in the soil where they decayed. What we see in the monument burials is a select sample, the important people, the people whose family lines controlled access to the tomb. The Bell Beaker migration adds another dimension to this fine-scale picture. In the period immediately following the Bell Beaker arrival in Britain, the ancient DNA record shows a pattern that is consistent not just with large-scale population replacement, but with specific social stratification. The high-status graves, the graves with the most elaborate goods, the most prestigious objects, are overwhelmingly associated with individuals of high-step ancestry, while the rarer graves of individuals with more Neolithic ancestry tend to be less elaborately furnished. This is a very tentative finding, and researchers are careful to note that the sample sizes involved are small and that confounding factors abound. But if it is real, it suggests that the Bell Beaker transition in Britain was not just a demographic replacement, but a social reorganization, the imposition by the incoming population of a new social hierarchy in which ancestry from the steppe conferred status and ancestry from the preceding Neolithic population was associated with lower social standing. This would be consistent with models of the Bell Beaker migration that emphasize its elite or warrior character, the idea that the Bell Beaker complex spread partly through the movements of high status militarily capable individuals who were able to impose their cultural and genetic dominance on the populations they encountered. The Bell Beaker burial assemblage, the copper dagger, the gold ornaments, the archer's wrist guard, is an assemblage of prestige and martial display, and the individuals buried with these objects appear to have been people who occupied a particular kind of social position, one associated with violence and wealth and status. If those individuals were disproportionately of high-step ancestry, and if the Neolithic ancestry individuals in the population had lower status, then the social dynamics of the Bell Beaker transition in Britain may have been more like a conquest than a migration in the conventional sense. But conquest of whom, exactly? This is where the story becomes particularly interesting. The Bell Beaker migrants did not arrive in an empty landscape. They arrived in a Britain that was densely occupied by Neolithic farmers, people who had themselves been in Britain for perhaps 1,000 years, who had cleared the forests and built the monuments and established the communities and developed the social structures that the genetic evidence is beginning to reveal. These were people who had built Stonehenge. They had invested enormously in labor, in social organization, in the spiritual significance of these places, in the transformation of the British landscape. And within a few centuries of the Bell Beaker arrival, they were essentially gone as a genetic presence. What happened to them? The same question that was asked about the Western hunter-gatherers must now be asked, again, about the Neolithic farmers. And the answer is, again, that we do not know for certain. Disease is, again, a candidate. The steppe populations brought with them a background of contact with different disease vectors, and the Neolithic farmers of Britain may have had limited immunity to what the newcomers carried. Violence is again a candidate. The Bell Beaker people were, by the evidence of their burial goods, a militarized culture in ways that the late Neolithic farming communities may not have been. Demographic advantage is again a candidate. The steppe people's pastoral economy may have been better adapted to a changing climate that was making sedentary farming in some regions more difficult. The climate itself is worth noting in this context. The period around 4,000 years ago, when the Bell Beaker transition was occurring in Britain, is associated with evidence of significant climatic disruption, a period of cooling and increased storminess that had significant effects on agricultural productivity across parts of Europe. The Neolithic farming communities of Britain, which depended on a relatively stable climate for their crops and their herds, may have been weakened by this disruption in ways that made them more vulnerable to displacement by the more mobile, pastorally oriented Bell Beaker people, whose way of life was perhaps better adapted to a more variable climate. The climate disruption hypothesis is speculative. The evidence is suggestive but not conclusive, and researchers are cautious about reading a direct causal relationship from the correlation between climatic events and demographic changes in the ancient DNA record. But it is one of several factors that researchers are beginning to integrate into a more complex model of the Bell Beaker transition, a model in which the replacement of the Neolithic farmers was not the result of a single cause, but of a convergence of multiple stresses, all of which happened to coincide in a way that produced an outcome of exceptional completeness. There is something in this, in the idea of multiple stresses converging, that resonates with wider patterns in population history. The most complete population replacements in the historical and prehistoric record are rarely the result of a single catastrophic event. They are the result of the accumulation of disadvantages of a population being pressed from multiple directions simultaneously, by disease and violence and climate and demographic pressure and social disruption, until the capacity for recovery is exhausted and the decline becomes irreversible. The Western hunter-gatherers of Britain faced the arrival of a more numerous, differently equipped population at the same time that the closure of Doggerland had isolated them from the continental gene pool that might have replenished their numbers. The Neolithic farmers faced the arrival of the Bell Beaker people at the same time that the climate was becoming less favorable for their agricultural system. In both cases, the vulnerability created by one set of circumstances was exploited, consciously or not, by the pressure created by another. The modern world is not immune to these dynamics, though they play out differently in a world with writing and recording and the institutional memory that documentation provides. The populations that disappeared in British prehistory did so in silence, silently. because there was no one to write down what was happening, no one to record the names of the displaced, no archive in which the lost culture's particulars could be preserved against oblivion. All that remained was the genome, the last, most durable record of a people's existence, written in the chemistry of the cells, surviving in the petrous bone behind the ear for 9,000 years, until someone came along with the tools to read it. The genome is a kind of memory, the most involuntary and the most durable kind. It does not record what people believed, or what they said, or what they feared, or what they loved. It records only the bare fact of descent, who came from whom, where their parents came from, what populations their lineage passed through on its way to the present. But in that bare fact, something of enormous significance is preserved, the fact of existence. The fact that these people were here, that they lived and died and had children, and contributed something, however faint, however diluted, to the continuous chain of human beings that leads from the earliest post-Ice Age inhabitants of these islands to the people reading and listening to this story today. The contribution of the Western hunter-gatherers to modern British genomes is almost immeasurably small, but it is not nothing. Even in the most heavily replaced populations, statistical methods can sometimes detect a faint residual signal, a ghost of the ghost, a trace of the people who were here first, diluted to near invisibility by 2,000 years of being overwhelmed by more numerous peoples, but still present, still detectable, still whispering in the data. This is the most poignant finding of the ancient DNA revolution, and the one that deserves the most careful attention. The people of Cheddar Man's lineage did not disappear entirely. They were reduced to a fragment, a shadow, a signal so faint that it requires the most sophisticated statistical tools of modern genetics to detect. But they are there, in some small measure, in the genomes of some modern British people, a lingering trace of the people who walked the Mesolithic forests, who fished the rivers and the coasts, who wore antler headdresses and made marks in bone and buried their dead with ochre. They are there, they were here. And the story of who they were, fragmentary, incomplete, still being reconstructed from the evidence of bones and stones and the most intimate possible record, the sequence of their own DNA, is a story worth telling and worth hearing and worth holding carefully in the mind as something genuinely significant, not just because it is old, or because it is strange, or because it overturns comfortable assumptions about British identity, but because these were people, because their world was real, and their lives were lived, and their vanishing was a loss of something irreplaceable, something that will never come again. The debate within the scientific community about the mechanisms of Neolithic and Bell Beaker replacement is ongoing, and it is a debate worth understanding in some detail because it reflects genuine uncertainty about one of the most important demographic events in the history of human populations in Europe. The dominant position in the ancient DNA field, the position associated with researchers like David Reich at Harvard, whose lab has produced many of the most important ancient DNA studies of the past decade, and with Johannes Krauss and Wolfgang Haak at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, emphasizes the scale and completeness of the genetic replacements and tends to interpret them as evidence of large-scale migrations by populations that were demographically much more successful than the people they displaced. In this view, the Neolithic transition and the Bell Beaker transition were primarily driven by the movement of large numbers of people from the source regions, Anatolia, and the Pontic-Caspian steppe, respectively, into Europe, with the incoming populations growing rapidly and replacing the indigenous peoples over the course of a few centuries. A minority view, associated with researchers who are more cautious about the degree to which genetic data can be used to infer demographic processes, emphasizes the uncertainty in the current models and the potential for alternative explanations. These researchers note that the ancient DNA samples available are still relatively small and geographically uneven, and that statistical methods for inferring population dynamics from genetic data make assumptions that may not always be valid. They note that the replacement could, in theory, have been produced by smaller numbers of incoming migrants if those migrants had significant advantages, disease, technology, social organization that allowed them to achieve high reproductive success relative to the indigenous population. There is also a debate about the role of violence specifically, about whether the genetic replacements were accompanied by genocide or near genocide of the displaced populations, or whether the replacements were primarily the result of differential birth and death rates over extended periods without any single catastrophic violent event. This is a debate that cannot currently be resolved from the genetic data alone, because the genetic record does not preserve the distinction between a people killed quickly and a people who declined slowly. Both produce the same outcome in the data: the rapid disappearance of one genetic profile and its replacement by another. The archaeological record, to the extent that it is informative on this question, is ambiguous. There is evidence of violence at some Neolithic sites in Europe, as noted earlier. There is evidence of fortification and defensive architecture at some late Neolithic and early Bronze Age sites that might suggest an era of increased intergroup conflict. But there is also evidence of continuity in some cultural practices of Neolithic traditions being maintained into the early Bronze Age, of the monument complexes, like Stonehenge, continuing to be used and modified by populations that were genetically very different from those who had built them. This cultural continuity in the face of genetic discontinuity is one of the most interesting aspects of the transition, and one that is still being worked out. Stonehenge itself is a perfect example. The earliest phases of the monument were built by the Anatolian Neolithic population, people of an entirely different genetic background from the Bell Beaker migrants who would replace them. The later and most famous phases, the Great Sarsen Trilithons, the Blue Stone Circle, the monument in roughly the form that tourists visit today, were erected in the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age, in a period that overlaps with, and follows, the Bell Beaker transition. The people who erected the Sarsens were genetically very different from the people who had initiated the monument. They may have understood its significance differently, or not at all, or in a completely transformed way. But they chose to continue working on it, to invest the extraordinary effort required to transport 40-ton stones from Marlborough Downs and erect them in a place that had been sacred to their predecessors for centuries. Why? We do not know. We cannot know. But the fact that a people who had replaced their predecessors almost completely, genetically, chose to continue and elaborate, the most significant monument of those predecessors, suggests that the genetic replacement was not accompanied by a complete cultural erasure, that something of what Stonehenge meant, or what the landscape around Stonehenge meant, survived the transition and was sufficiently compelling to motivate the continuation of the project. What that something was is unknowable, lost in the silence that surrounds all human motivation that was not written down. The bluestone question is a particularly fascinating part of the Stonehenge story in this context. The bluestones of Stonehenge, the smaller inner circle of spotted dolerite and rhyolite and other rock types, were transported to Salisbury Plain from the Preseli Hills in southwest Wales, a distance of roughly 230 miles. This was not an engineering project, in the simple sense of moving heavy objects a long way. It was a project of extraordinary symbolic and cultural significance, of choosing stones from a specific and distant place, a place with its own sacred associations in the Neolithic world of Britain, and bringing them to Salisbury Plain to be incorporated into a monument that already existed and that was being elaborated and transformed. The people who transported those bluestones, who organized the logistics, who provided the labor, who understood the significance of what they were doing were, in the current state of the ancient DNA evidence, primarily of Neolithic Anatolian ancestry, at least in the early phases. They were the people who had replaced the Western hunter-gatherers and who would themselves shortly be replaced by the Bell Beaker people. They were in a particular historical moment, a moment of their greatest cultural florescence, of the most ambitious monument-building projects in the island's history, and also, though they could not have known it, in the last centuries of their demographic dominance. The scale and sophistication of late Neolithic British culture, Stonehenge, Avebury, Silbury Hill, the Cursus monuments, the timber circles, the Neolithic mines at Grimes Graves in Norfolk, where flint was extracted from shafts 30 feet deep, speaks to a population that was organized, productive, capable of extraordinary collective effort, and embedded in a rich and complex cultural world. Whatever the mechanisms of its eventual replacement, the late Neolithic civilization of Britain was not a simple or primitive thing. It was a genuine civilization, in the sense that word deserves a complex, organized, culturally sophisticated human community with its own cosmology, its own architecture, its own social hierarchies, its own ways of understanding and marking time and space. And it is gone, not because it failed, or stagnated, or exhausted itself, but because it was replaced by people who came from far away and who were genetically and culturally very different from the people they displaced. The monuments remain Stonehenge, Avebury, the Long Barrows, the Cursus, because they were made of stone and earth and are harder to destroy than the people who made them. But the people who made them are as absent from the genetic record of modern Britain as the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who preceded them. This double erasure, the hunter-gatherers erased by the farmers erased by the Bell Beaker people, is what makes the ancient DNA story of Britain so extraordinary. Most places on Earth experienced one major prehistoric population replacement. Britain experienced at least two, each nearly complete, each following the previous with a rapidity that, in demographic terms, is almost without parallel in the wider prehistoric record. And in the wake of these two replacements, the Britain that emerged, the Bronze Age Britain of the Bell Beaker descendants, the Britain that would develop through the Iron Age into the historical period, was a Britain whose genetic foundation bore almost no resemblance to the people who had first walked the Mesolithic forests after the ice retreated. The question this raises, the question that the ancient DNA revolution has made it impossible to avoid, is what all of this means for the concept of indigenous people, at least as applied to Britain. The term indigenous typically implies a people who have been in a place from time immemorial, or at least from a time before the arrival of the people who displaced or currently surround them. In the context of British history, the Celtic-speaking Iron Age population is sometimes described as indigenous to Britain in relation to the Romans and Anglo-Saxons. The pre-Roman population is sometimes described as indigenous in relation to both. But the ancient DNA evidence shows that every population that has been in Britain, going back as far as the record currently allows, arrived at some point, replaced someone who was there before them, and was either replaced in turn or transformed by subsequent arrivals. The Western hunter-gatherers replaced nobody that we know of in Britain. They arrived into a landscape that was genuinely empty of humans, repopulated after the glaciers left. They have the strongest claim to indigenous status in the island's history. And they are the population that left the least genetic legacy in any modern group, the population that was replaced most completely by the people who came after them. The people with the deepest roots were the most thoroughly erased. There is something in this that resists easy moral or political framing. It is not a story about victims and perpetrators in any simple sense, because the Neolithic farmers who replaced the hunter-gatherers were themselves replaced, and the Bell Beaker people who replaced the farmers were themselves modified and added to by subsequent waves of migration. Every group in this story was, at different moments, both the replacer and the replaced. Every group that was displaced had itself displaced someone before them. The cycle is not comfortable to contemplate, but it is what the evidence shows, and the evidence asks us to sit with it, rather than resolve it into a cleaner narrative. What the ancient DNA of Britain's oldest remains tells us, most fundamentally, is that the island has been a place of extraordinary demographic flux of population movements on a scale and with a completeness that conventional, historical, and archaeological thinking had not imagined before the genetic tools became available to reveal it. The stability and the continuity that the landscape itself projects, the ancient hills, the ancient rivers, the monuments that have stood for 5,000 years, is a stability of geography, not of people. The land has been continuous. The people on the land have changed, repeatedly and radically. There is also, in this story, a profound lesson about the limits of appearance as a guide to ancestry. Cheddar Man's face, dark-skinned, blue-eyed, unmistakably, the face of a real person, tells us that the people who were in Britain first looked nothing like what most people today imagine when they imagine ancient Britons. The dark skin of the Mesolithic was replaced, over the subsequent millennia, by the lighter pigmentation that the Neolithic farmers and Bell Beaker migrants brought with them. The blue eyes may have persisted. Blue eyes are relatively common in modern British populations, and the genetic variants associated with them may trace in part to the Mesolithic ancestry that survives in small quantities in modern genomes. But the combination dark skin and blue eyes is gone, as thoroughly as the rest of what Cheddar Man was. He is in a sense a double surprise. Surprising because his appearance is so different from what people expected, and surprising because his DNA is so different from any modern population. Both surprises point in the same direction, toward the recognition that the past is a foreign country, that the people who came before us were genuinely different from us, and that the story of who we are and where we came from is far more complex and far more interesting than the simplified versions we typically tell ourselves. The ancient DNA revolution is still young. The sample sizes are growing. The methods are improving. The questions are getting more precise. In the next decade, researchers expect to have enough ancient genomes from Britain and surrounding regions to trace individual family histories across generations, to map the movements of specific lineages through the landscape over centuries, to identify the moments of contact and mixing and replacement with a resolution that is currently impossible. They expect to be able to say, with increasing confidence, not just what happened in broad demographic terms, but how it happened, the timing, the roots, the social contexts in which different populations came into contact, and the outcomes of those contacts. What they will not be able to recover, what no genetic technology, however sophisticated, will ever be able to recover, is the inner lives of the people involved. The languages are gone. The stories are gone. The knowledge of the land, built up over millennia of intimate relationship with a specific landscape, is gone. The spiritual practices, the social customs, the ways of understanding what it meant to be a person in the world, gone. The genome records the fact of existence, but not the content of it. And it is the content, the particular, irreducible, unrepeatable specificity of what it meant to be a Western hunter-gatherer in Mesolithic Britain, or an Anatolian Neolithic farmer in the shadow of an unfinished Stonehenge that is the real loss. The genome is what survives, the people are what is lost. And the distance between those two things, between the dry chemical record of a life and the living reality of that life, as it was experienced by the person living it, is the measure of what we cannot know, and what we should not pretend to know, and what we should, perhaps, feel the weight of knowing that we do not know. The question of what happened specifically at the boundary, at the moment of contact between the Western hunter-gatherers and the arriving Neolithic farmers, is one that has occupied researchers intensely, and in recent years, the ancient DNA record has begun to offer some answers that are more specific than the general demographic picture allows. One study, published in Nature in 2019 by a team led by Mark Thomas at University College London, and using ancient DNA from both British and Irish Neolithic samples, found evidence that suggested the transition from hunter-gatherer to farmer in these islands was not a single event, but a process with structure. The earliest farmer samples in the British dataset, those dating to the very beginning of the Neolithic, around 6,000 years ago, showed the highest proportions of Anatolian Neolithic ancestry, consistent with a founding population that arrived with very little local admixture. But in later Neolithic samples, taken from the centuries and centuries that followed, the proportion of hunter-gatherer ancestry, while still low, was not zero, and in some regional datasets, it was measurably higher than in the earliest samples. This pattern could be interpreted in multiple ways. One interpretation is that hunter-gatherers did not simply disappear at the moment of farmer arrival, but persisted in some form in the margins, perhaps in the more remote areas of the landscape, in the coastal and woodland environments, where their way of life was still viable, and that over centuries, they gradually admixed with the farming population at rates that left small but detectable traces in the genetic record. Another interpretation is that the pattern reflects not ongoing hunter-gatherer survival, but the arrival of later waves of Neolithic migrants, who had themselves, in their journey across continental Europe, absorbed more hunter-gatherer ancestry than the initial colonizing population. Both interpretations have implications, The first hunter-gatherer persistence suggests a more complex and contested history of the British Neolithic than the simple replacement story allows. If hunter-gatherers were still living in Britain centuries after the farmers arrived, then the relationship between the two populations was not a single event of displacement, but an extended period of coexistence and competition and occasional contact. The farmers' monuments rose, while the hunters still moved through the forests. They may have watched each other across the cleared edges of the agricultural land. They may occasionally have met, traded, fought, intermarried, all the things that human populations do when they inhabit the same landscape. The second interpretation, later migration waves, carrying more admixed ancestry, is perhaps less romantically compelling, but is also consistent with what we know about the general pattern of the Neolithic expansion across Europe. The Neolithic did not spread from Anatolia to Britain in a single leap. It moved through the Mediterranean, through Central Europe, along the Atlantic facade, through a series of successive population movements that each contributed to the spreading genetic profile of the Neolithic expansion. Each stage of this spreading carried a slightly different genetic composition, slightly modified by contact with the local populations it encountered. By the time the Neolithic reached Britain, at the northwestern edge of this expansion, the genetic profile of the arriving farmers would have included traces of contact with continental hunter-gatherers accumulated over the long journey from their Anatolian origins. Disentangling these two interpretations, ongoing local admixture versus inheritance of admixture from the migration chain, is extremely difficult, and the current data does not fully allow it. But even the uncertainty itself is informative. It tells us that the boundary between farmer and hunter-gatherer in Neolithic Britain was not a clean line, but a complex zone of interaction whose details are still being worked out. The Bell Beaker arrival presents a somewhat different picture. Here, the transition appears more abrupt in the data. The shift from predominantly Anatolian Neolithic ancestry to predominantly steppe ancestry in Britain appears to occur over a shorter time window, and the pattern of mixing in the early Bell Beaker period is less clear than in the Neolithic transition. Some researchers have suggested that this reflects a more rapid and more conflictual process of displacement in the Bell Beaker case, that the Bell Beaker migrants arrived in sufficient numbers and with sufficient strategic advantages to overwhelm the existing Neolithic population relatively quickly, without the extended period of coexistence and gradual admixture that may have characterized the Neolithic transition. But this is contested. The archaeological record of the Bell Beaker period in Britain includes sites where Neolithic and Bell Beaker cultural elements appear side by side, where the pottery and grave goods of the Bell Beaker tradition are found alongside monuments and practices with deep Neolithic roots, suggesting that the two populations were in contact and, to some extent, were adopting elements of each other's material culture, even as the genetic replacement was proceeding. The continuation of Stonehenge's use and elaboration across the transition is the most dramatic example of this cultural continuity in the face of demographic replacement, but it is not the only one. The genomes of the Bell Beaker period also show, in some cases, individuals whose ancestry is intermediate between the high steppe and the Neolithic profiles, individuals who appear to be the offspring of mixed pairings between the incoming and the existing populations. These individuals are not common in the dataset, but their presence confirms that some level of admixture was occurring, that the process of replacement was not entirely exclusionary, and that the biological boundary between the two populations was permeable, even as the overall demographic tide was running strongly in one direction. What the fine-scale picture shows, in other words, is that the large-scale story of replacement is real and robust, but that within it, at the level of individual lives and individual choices, the full complexity of human interaction was operating. People met. People mixed, sometimes. People adopted each other's material culture. People continued to use the sacred places of their predecessors. And all of this happened in the shadow of a demographic transformation that would ultimately leave very little of the prior population in the subsequent genetic record. This is the human condition in intensified form, the collision of large-scale historical forces with individual lives, each of which is irreducibly particular and cannot be reduced to the statistical aggregate. The ancient DNA data shows us the aggregate. It cannot show us the particular. It cannot show us the moments, the meetings, the negotiations, the acts of violence and of kindness and of accommodation and of resistance that made up the actual experience of living through a population replacement. Those moments are gone. All that remains is the signal in the data and the monuments in the landscape and the occasional bone in the right condition to yield its secrets to a machine that was not invented until 10,000 years after the bone's owner died. The relationship between ancient DNA and the landscape of Britain, between the genetic story and the physical world that is still here to be walked through and visited and experienced, is one of the more underappreciated dimensions of this research. The landscape of southern England is still, to an extraordinary degree, a landscape shaped by the Neolithic population, whose genetics have almost entirely disappeared from the gene pool. The long barrows that stand on the chalk downlands Wayland's Smithy in Oxfordshire, West Kennet in Wiltshire, Belus Knapp in the Cotswolds are the monuments of those Anatolian ancestry farmers. Stonehenge and Avebury are their legacy. The field systems that underlie later agricultural landscapes in many parts of England, detectable from the air or in the subtle undulations of old pasture land, were laid out, in many cases, by Neolithic farmers who have no living descendants in any meaningful sense. Modern Britons walk through a landscape that was fundamentally shaped by people who are not their ancestors. The sacred geography of pre-Roman Britain, the hills, the earthworks, the stone circles, the alignments was created by people whose genetic contribution to the modern British gene pool is vanishingly small. The connection that many modern Britons feel to Stonehenge, to Avebury, to the long barrows, the sense that these are ancestral places connected to the deep roots of British identity, is a connection that is cultural rather than biological. It is a connection through proximity, through inhabitation, through the long familiarity of a landscape feature that has been there for as long as anyone in Britain can remember. It is not a connection through ancestry. This does not make it less real or less significant. Cultural connections to landscapes are among the most powerful and important forms of human relationship to the physical world, and the fact that a connection is cultural rather than biological does not diminish it. The people who visit Stonehenge today, who feel something in the presence of the great stones, who feel, however they articulate it, that they are in the presence of something ancient and significant, are right, that they are in the presence of something ancient and significant. They are just also, if the ancient DNA evidence is accurate, in the presence of the most enduring legacy of a people who are not their ancestors in any biological sense. The ancient DNA revolution has not, in any simple sense, solved the mystery of who the first Britons were. It has made that mystery richer, stranger, and more precisely described than it was before. It has given us Cheddar Man's face. It has given us the extraordinary completeness of the replacement story. It has revealed the ghost populations and the fine-scale family structures and the patterns of admixture and resistance that complicate the large-scale narrative. And it has raised questions about identity, about belonging, about the relationship between genetic ancestry and cultural inheritance that it cannot itself answer, and that will continue to be argued about and thought about and felt about by anyone who takes the time to sit with what the evidence is saying. What the evidence is saying, at its most fundamental, is this. The people who left their traces in the oldest bones of Britain were not the ancestors of the people who live there now. They were earlier people who came from different places and who lived in different ways, and who were replaced by the relentless demographic pressure of subsequent migrations. They were real. They were specific. They had names and faces and blue eyes and dark skin and antler headdresses and the knowledge of 10,000 years of intimate relationship with a landscape that is still here to be walked through. And they are gone, and their going is a loss. And the ancient DNA that their bones preserved is not a substitute for what was lost, but only a record of the fact that they existed. The fact that they existed is not nothing. It is, in the context of all the silence that surrounds it, a great deal. The field of ancient genomics will continue to produce new findings about Britain's prehistoric populations. New samples will be extracted and sequenced. New methods will allow finer resolution of population dynamics. The picture that is currently emerging, compelling, complex, in some ways shocking, will be refined, and in some places revised. But the core story is unlikely to change fundamentally. Britain has been home, at different times, to populations that are genetically quite distinct from each other and from the people who live there today. The deepest layers of that history are the most thoroughly lost. And the question of what those early people were like as cultures, as societies, as human beings making meaning in a world that no longer exists will remain, in all its fullness, permanently unanswerable. That unanswerable quality is not a failure of research or a limitation of the technology. It is a consequence of what it means to be a human being, living in time to be part of a chain of lives that reaches back into a past that was just as vivid and just as real and just as full of particular, irreducible experience as the present is, and that is now lost in a way that no amount of knowledge can fully recover. The ancient DNA is a message in a bottle. It tells us that the bottle existed and roughly where it was launched. But the message, the actual content of what it meant to be those people, in that time, in that place, was written in a language that no longer exists, and the bottle is all we have. Cheddar Man looks out from his reconstruction with blue eyes that saw a Britain that has not existed for 9,000 years. He is one of the last legible pages of a book that was burned long ago. And what he tells us, looking out from that reconstruction with those particular eyes in that particular face, is that the past was full of people who were not like us, who are not here, and who deserve at minimum the recognition that they were real. Thank you for spending this time with this story. If the depth and the strangeness of this history is something you want to keep exploring, if you find yourself reaching for the questions that the official record leaves unasked, please click like and subscribe. Leave a comment telling me what you found most surprising, or most difficult to sit with, or most important to understand. These are the histories that most of us were never taught, and they deserve to be heard. There is one more thing worth dwelling on before the subject can be set down. It concerns the nature of the question itself, the question that the evidence has been circling toward, without quite arriving at a final answer for the entire length of this account. The DNA of Britain's oldest remains does not match any modern population. This is what the sequences showed, and what the comparative databases confirmed, and what the papers in the peer-reviewed literature have documented with increasing precision over the past 15 years. The Western hunter-gatherers of Mesolithic Britain were genetically distinct from any population currently living anywhere on Earth. They exist only in the ancient record, in the bones, in the moments of preservation that the geological luck of caves and peat bogs and waterlogged archaeology provided. But the question, so who were they, is the question that genetics can only partially answer. The genetics tells us where they came from the refugia of southwestern Europe, from the populations that survived the Ice Age and spread northward as the climate improved. It tells us what they probably looked like, dark-skinned, light-eyed. It tells us what they could and could not digest, what diseases they were likely resistant to. It tells us how distantly they were related to every living human population. What it cannot tell us is who they were as people, what they called themselves, what they believed was waiting for them after death. What they said to each other in the language or languages that have left no recoverable trace in any living tongue. What they feared, what they wanted for their children. These are not questions that can be answered. The evidence that could answer them was made of sound and breath and gesture, ephemeral, gone. The genome is durable, the person is not. And yet the person is what matters. The genome is only interesting because it belonged to someone. The data points to lives that were real, to mornings when someone woke in Mesolithic Somerset and went to the river for water, to evenings when someone sat outside a shelter in Yorkshire and listened to the forest at dusk, to moments of grief and joy and ordinary human experience, as dense and as specific as any moment being experienced by any person anywhere right now. Who were they? They were the people of the Mesolithic. They were the people who were in Britain first, after the ice, in the forests and on the shores and by the rivers. They sustained themselves for 5,000 years without farming, without writing, without the infrastructure of civilization, as subsequent populations would build it. They left a footprint on the land light enough that the land absorbed it entirely, leaving only the faintest traces, the middens, the worked flints, the occasional burial in a cave with enough limestone above it to preserve what the years would otherwise have dissolved. Some small fraction of what they were survives in the genomes of modern Europeans, a shadow of a shadow, detectable only by the most sensitive statistical methods. But even that fraction is something. Even the ghost of a ghost is a kind of presence. They were here, in the forests of Mesolithic Britain, in the places that are still there to be visited: Somerset, Yorkshire, Wales, the coasts and the river valleys, and the heathlands. They were here. They looked at the same hills. They heard the same rivers. And somewhere in the petrous bone behind the ear of a skeleton lying in a Somerset cave, their chemistry exists still, preserved against time by the accident of geology, waiting for the technology that would eventually arrive to read it. The technology arrived. It read the bone. It told us who they were, not any modern population, not any living group. And in that negation, in that absence from the chart of current human diversity, it told us something true and important: that the past was full of people we have never met, cannot meet, and can only partially imagine, that those people were real, that they mattered, that the fact of their existence and the fact of their vanishing deserves more attention than it has typically received. The DNA of Britain's oldest remains does not match any modern population, and that is the beginning of the story, not the end of it. The hills are still there, the rivers are still running,